there's so much data about the next generations looking for an organization with purpose. It's just blurred so much that the people do need to bring their full self, or want to, or have no choice but to bring their full self to work, and want to be seen as a human and as a person, not just a cog in an organization's wheel. In every leader, that a heart was always there, but the heart's got to get equal play in how you're going to really motivate and inspire people. That is, of course, when the best outcomes come for any of your companies.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors. Insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
It is a real pleasure for me to have Joe Davis with me today. I had former governor of Indiana and former president of Purdue University, Mitch Daniels, join me last week. And as I read Joe's book, I couldn't help but think of Mitch Daniels as being an extremely generous leader. Joe and I will jump into his book and talk a lot about his book on generous leadership. But having the former governor and president of Purdue, who's done such amazing things with Purdue University, on last week was a real treat. And it's well worth a listen to anyone who missed last week's episode. Let me do a quick intro, Joe, to you, and then we'll dive into our conversation. Joe Davis is a managing director and senior partner at Boston Consulting Group, BCG. Joe has been with BCG for over 35 years, co-founded the Washington, D.C. office, led office systems, started BCG's public sector business, led BCG North America, and is the current chair of BCG's Center for Inclusion and Equity. For those people who don't know, BCG is one of the big three management consulting firms, along with Bain and McKinsey. BCG has revenues of over $12 billion and 32,000 consultants around the globe, advising major corporations as well as nonprofits and all sorts of other enterprises. Joe earned his BA from Whitman College, where he is the current board chair, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Joe has been married to his wife, Sarah, for over 40 years. They have 4 children and 8 grandchildren. His recently published book, which I just mentioned, The Generous Leader, 7 Ways to Give of Yourself for Everyone's Gain, will be the focus of much of what we discuss today on the webcast. Joe, it's great to have you with me. BCG was the one management consulting firm that did not give me an offer.
Oh, I knew you were going to say that.
Out of HBS. And so I feel a little bit intimidated having a senior BCG partner on the Walker Webcast. I hope you don't ask me to do a case interview while the two of us are having this discussion.
I won't do that. I'm more afraid you're going to do that to me.
Well,
I will say, following those last week's guests, I'm quite honored and privileged to be here.
It's great. So you talk a lot about authentic leadership and about showing your true self and about being curious and not knowing all the answers. But I want to jump back for a second to the fall of 1986. And you've just arrived on the campus of Harvard Business School and you're taking your seat in section G.
Listen to you. You did your homework.
And you look around at all the Yale and Stanford grads and you ask yourself, do I belong here having gone to Whitman College? How authentic was Joe Davis in that sitting?
That's a very interesting question, because not just having gone to Whitman College, but having started as a Procter & Gamble sales rep, and all these other people were, 2 years analysts at Goldman and these places. I'm not sure if I was authentic rather than just sit back and hope I can survive through the 2 years, or at least the first year of the session. Although, we'll see where we go this really, but there were some very lessons early on in my life that probably taught me the value of authenticity and vulnerability sooner than I might have learned it otherwise. And, many are nervous about vulnerability even to this, no matter how long they've been in a career.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
You and I both are friends with John Rice. John Rice came out to our all company meeting 2 weeks ago and ran our senior leadership team through an exercise. And his question to everyone in the room was, who in the room likes to dance? And a couple hands went up. And then he said, who kind of will dance if you're kind of forced to at a wedding? And a number of other hands went up. And then he said, who hates dancing? And a ton of hands went up, and he picked someone on my senior management team who happened to be a white male. And he said, "So Jim, how do you feel when you walk out on that dance floor?" He said, "Oh man, I feel like the eyes of the world are on me. I feel really like I got two left feet. I feel like I'm the most uncoordinated dancer in the world, and that I'm like, going to make a fool of myself, and that everyone's watching me and all that kind of stuff." And John looked after Jim had given all these criteria, and he looked at him and he said, "That's how most minorities feel when they walk in to any type of corporate environment where they are one of few or the only one." And I want to stick there for a moment as it relates to how you felt in that classroom in 1986, being I'm assuming the only Whitman graduate in the room with all these other people. Did you feel like you belonged?
Probably not. So you're saying, and that, as well as not just the Whitman, but the 2-year Bain consultant, 2-year McKinsey consultant, 2-year Goldman Sachs. I mean, these people, I thought, they were up on a pedestal in my mind. At that time, quite colorblind about it, but I didn't feel like I belonged for many, many months,
And so
belong's a big word. I didn't feel like I should have deserved to be there. There's something, belong's a big word. I mean, I didn't feel like it was a bunch of people. I got that.
But believe me, as a St. Lawrence University grad and the only one in my class, and there was one person a year ahead of me who went to St. Lawrence, but as the only one in my class from St. Lawrence, I felt very much like you did. So my questions to you are because I felt the exact same way. Yeah. I felt as if I didn't belong. I felt and the reason I'm going at that is that, could you be your authentic self? Because your book talks a lot about leaders being their authentic selves. And it's pretty easy for you and me, given our successful careers, to be authentic, to talk openly, show our vulnerabilities, whatever. But I can guarantee you the only thing that I wouldn't do in the fall of 1993 at Harvard Business School was show that I was vulnerable, show that I didn't know the answer to something. And so I sit there and read your book that talks about show that you learn from failures, show that you don't have all the answers. And that all sounds great and good, except when you're younger or earlier in your career, you really don't have the ability to do that.
No. And you're right. As I think back, I don't, we had to raise our hand once, a couple times a semester, right? So I did raise my hand sometimes, but it was with huge fear that I wouldn't know what to say relative to all these other people. It's so funny. You're kind of sit back, Willy, because this is like so ridiculous, of course, to thought that way. No, and early on, I mean, I think this whole idea now of vulnerability in particular, but even authenticity, I believe most, you learn over time as you realize, wow, if I show a little myself or show that I don't know the answer, someone else kind of reveals they don't. And then we both, release roadblocks. But that takes time, experience, testing yourself. If I may, I'll tell an interesting story. There's a BCG partner, actually a black male, which is relevant story. He said I would never admit I didn't know something. And I would, so if the team looks like they're about to get stuck and we're going to turn to me and say, well, what do you think we should do? Before I would, get caught out having to say, I don't know. I might leave the room. I might take, I would just disappear. Now that's pretty heavy. And he said, one time I thought, this is just an utter waste of time. It's just, and he said, everybody, I don't know either. And he said, it was huge. Oh, you don't know? Oh, wow. None of us know. And this like breath of fresh air goes in the room. The energy heightens up. Well, let's just brainstorm. And he said, wow, that was quite a lesson for me. A little bit of vulnerability. I don't know. That's not the biggest vulnerability in the world, of course. And it freed everybody else who was also stuck to kind of start to brainstorm and be creative and not just remain stuck. So but that, that takes all of us time and some kind of stepping over a little line into that kind of space and discover either the benefits that were there or that's usually and of course it doesn't hurt that much, depending how far you step.
Well, I mean, so that story is an interesting one about your colleague at BCG. I'll tell one from our introductions at HBS. So we're sitting in our section room and introductions start, and the first person up says, "Oh, I went to Yale undergrad and rowed on the U.S. junior national rowing team. And I worked at Goldman Sachs." And I'm sitting here and I'm going, I went to St. Lawrence University, worked in Latin America, and somehow or another found myself at Harvard Business School. And so as the intros are getting closer and closer to me, my stress level is getting higher and higher.
Your heart's going.
And we could fortunately only do about 10 introductions a day during lunch. So I had a couple days to stew over when it was going to get to me in the classroom. And about 6 people before it got to me, a gentleman in my section named Tim Huckaby stood up and he said, "My name is Tim Huckaby. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I went to Georgia Tech University and I applied to Harvard Business School 3 times and got turned down 3 times. And thank God I got in on my 4th try and I'm thrilled to be here." And all of a sudden, somebody in the room was human. Somebody in the room had shown that they actually had tried something and actually failed and hadn't walked onto the U.S. junior national rowing team. And it allowed everyone in the room to not just go to their bio and say, "I went to Yale and was on the U.S. junior national rowing team," but to say, "I'm, Lisa and I like to cook. I'm Charlie and I run in my free time." And it was that vulnerability that Tim Huckaby showed that was such a leap at that moment when everyone was saying, "You got to be perfect. You got to show your resume," that allowed everyone in the room to open up. And I've always admired Tim for taking that leap of faith. But I think about your colleague about exiting out of the room and to take the leap of faith to just say, "You know what? I don't know the answer." And then work with the team to find it.
Yeah, I'm sure that when you were 6 persons later, it was much easier. Thank heavens for Tim, for you, of course.
Yeah,
it is powerful. I was just thinking, I have dinners with BCG senior alums, once a month or so, and been in one city twice, and one of the same people came both times. And he's alumni of BCG. Many years ago, he had substance abuse addiction, and he lived it. But and I just think the dinner we had the other day, we go around and introduce each other, and he's maybe 6th out of 20. And people talk about how many kids they have, the job they have, nice stuff. He says, yep. He talks about that. Then he said, and of course, as some of you know, and boom, goes right into this addiction, and the rest of the conversations were much more interesting about people. They were more rich. They were more real because he had broken the same thing as the fellow Tim Huckaby had broken the ice that to share a bit of yourself while it hurts actually, relieves, frees everybody else to do the same. It's quite powerful.
As it relates to working with leaders, you've worked with business leaders at very challenging times, post 9/11, great financial crisis, the pandemic, and to some degree in the challenging times we face today. When you think about that construct of genuine leadership, of empathetic leadership, when times are tough, there's a sense in all of us that sort of when the times get tough, the tough get going. It's like you've got to fight hard with hard. You got to push back. And that these times, because they're unusually challenging as it relates to the way that technology is changing everything, the dynamics that we all face in the office and in the corporate world, that you sort of need to pick and be a tough leader. From reading your book, you debunk that notion.
Well, I challenge it. Yeah. Well, especially I think, Willy, a little bit interesting, that word is, what does someone mean by tough? And, let me make a few comments here. One thing, I was talking with Joaquin Duato, one of the people that interviewed for my book. He's the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. He said something to me very interesting, which ties to the whole concept here. He said, Joe, of course, trying's great, giving your best shot, but that doesn't matter. As a leader, outcomes matter. So you still have to drive results. But then he said, very interesting, he said, and the sooner you understand that and get past yourself and become mature enough to realize that the way you're going to drive those outcomes is by connecting with and listening to your people, the sooner you'll unleash, he said, the human traits that'll get you to the most exceptional outcomes. So it's very interesting. Joaquin, he's a long life and many time to learn this, but he started with, yes, you got to be tough enough to get results. Didn't use the word tough, but it's only coming through the people. So I think on your point, I was thinking about that. You're not the first person to ask me that. One thing, as I just said, you still have to drive results. You got to, I think one change, you have to think about all the stakeholders, of course, your investors and shareholders, but also the clients and customers, also your people and the community at large. But if I think about tough, you still have to make decisions. Nobody wants to wishy-washy and decisive, but you have to be tough enough to say, hey, I may be wrong, and change it, change the decision, which takes, some vulnerability and quote unquote toughness. The other thing I think you have to think about is being, this whole conversation, which is tough enough to be vulnerable and authentic. If you want to unleash your people, you've got to actually get past your own fears that are maybe not so tough, and show that you actually can connect with and, be human and enable them to be human. I mean, it's funny, Fran Katsoudas is the head of people policy and purpose at Cisco, the tech company. She said to me, when she started her career, a leader pulled her aside and said, you don't have enough killer instinct. You don't care. You should put that care away. You don't want to have as much of that as you do. She said, I didn't follow that advice. It wasn't authentic for her. And it didn't work out so well for that leader either, she pointed out. But she said she doesn't believe at all for today's leaders. And she said to me, she'll make tough decisions. She'll engage in intense issues. She will push people to move fast, but she'll always strive to do it with respect and care for the team, which is not dissimilar to Joaquin's point. Of course, we're going to get results. We're going to get it by teaming together and unleashing the potential of all of us. So I think, I don't know Jack Welch personally. That Jack Welch reputation, tough, I don't think works so much anymore. The Satya Nadella, great culture carrier, smart as heck, visionary, still a tough guy because he demands results. That tough is the kind of tough I think people are looking for. And Satya brings a lot more humanity, than maybe some of his other counterparts.
When you ran BCG North America, I think the number was 68% of the people that you managed inside of BCG North America were under 29 years old. Am I right?
You're right. Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
70% of the people are under 29. It was shocking, give or take.
Exactly. So you're meeting with that 68% of BCG North America consultants, and you're saying to them, you're either going to be a senior leader at BCG if you stay as being a consultant, or you're going to go into industry and potentially work up through the executive ranks to being leaders of your enterprises. To that 29-year-old BCG consultant, what do you tell him and her as it relates to how to grow, how to learn to get to Satya Nadella? In other words, as you and I talked about, there's a big difference between Joe and Willy sitting in those seats at HBS. Where the two of us sit today. And it's easy for me to read your book and say, I need to be more like that. But to someone who's trying to work their way up through the pecking order and show what makes him or her unique, how do you ingrain those skills in them as they're trying to make sure that no one thinks they're not the smartest person in the room? No one thinks that if they give them an assignment, they're not going to do it perfectly. I mean, there are a lot of things that you're saying leaders need to show and work with their team that, quite honestly, an individual trying to work up the ladder cannot show.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things. I mean, I think, to that 29-year-old, pretend you're him or her now. I mean, first thing I would say is, you really need to listen and engage and understand the lived experiences and the background of everybody and understand what they know that you don't know, so you get to a richer answer. That's, if I watch BCG or those people, and even clients I've seen over time who don't actually understand what's Willy's question, why is he asking this, what's in his head that I don't, that is so powerful. And too many, I don't think there's a single senior leader I talk to that doesn't say that over and over. Oh, I ask questions. It was every single one of them. Now you got to learn to do that. And, maybe asking questions shows a little bit of vulnerability. But I think that's the first and most important thing is really, if you're going to keep growing there, understand who you're working with, understand their people, understand they know things you don't know. They have experiences you haven't had, that when you put them together with you is going to be much more powerful. And that's, I think that goes a little bit of Joaquin's point. It takes some maturity to realize that. So maybe time is a little bit of an issue. But over time, and if you get burned a few times, I'll tell you one time I watched a client presenting to a steering committee. He was a CEO. He was the head of supply chain. He had a presentation going down this path. The CEO stopped him and asked a question that, came from the outside and zoom right to the middle. And he looked over, made a few statements, and then just went back to his presentation. And that CEO just glazed over. He stopped listening to the rest of the conversation. They thought, you didn't spend even 30 seconds say, well, Steve, why are you asking that question? What's in your head that I'm missing? That's a little bit of vulnerability, probably a little bit of fear of I have my presentation. I can't vary from it. What if I get caught off right in the answers I don't know? But I think this is such a powerful and most important capability or traits that if you're going to grow and really a listener, a leader who sees others as humans who have great potential to help you grow and build your business, that's probably pretty critical trait that I would tell any person to learn. Now, especially in consulting, because if I'm not in the head of the client, you're in trouble. The client doesn't want to. But anyway, we won't go to consulting.
No, but I think it's all super interesting because I do think that this broader topic of sort of diversity and inclusion, and then also sort of rank and file,
yes,
are somewhat interconnected in the sense that when you're trying to work your way up in a firm, you want to impress, you want to be smart, you want to get everything done as well or better than anybody else because you want to impress. And yet the skills that you really need to be a breakthrough leader aren't those skills. Yet you have to do that. I mean, you have to put in that time. And then also the sense of, you and I both been in rooms with, we were just talking about, 68% of BCG North America was people who were under 29 years old. You worked with a lot of people who were just starting their careers, who in a presentation to a client aren't going to be given the opportunity to speak, aren't going to be given the opportunity to ask the question because they're the associate who put the presentation together and did a great job on the PowerPoint and did a lot of great thinking behind the scene. But, when it's time to present to that client, it's Joe's the one who's going to do it, or somebody else who's the other lead on the engagement's going to do it. And so I just find it to be interesting about people to some degree finding their voice, if you will, and how to instill in people the ability to develop a voice, particularly whether it's you're the junior person on the team or whether you're the only Black person in the room or whether you're the only woman in the room, where you've got all that running through your head at the same time as the pecking order of who's there and actually supposed to contribute.
Yeah. Well, let me comment two ways. First off, to the junior person, but I'm going to get to a more important point in a second. There's plenty of opportunities for them to try to, there must have been a team meeting before to prepare for that presentation. Maybe they that's an opportunity to speak up. But I think the more important thing, and you mentioned the word inclusion. there's kind of 2 points, DE&I and inclusion. I speak about inclusion, meaning include many into your thinking, especially senior leaders who might be surrounded by their team. They're all, you're nodding right there, senior. And I've watched many good leaders, bring in the person that did the spreadsheet to the prep meeting and talk and ask that person a question. Ask them. Now they're going to be nervous. They're going to be scared, but it's pretty low risk. If they completely screwed up, that's one thing, but it's pretty low risk. They're inside the internal and they get a chance to engage. You learn something that you didn't know, probably that's not filtered by, all the levels. And they're beginning to learn those moves, but you as the leader are the one that has to make the first step to including them. And by that, I mean, engaging them and giving them a voice. I think I always start, not Zoom as much anymore, but meetings asking the least tenured person in the room a question, or on the screen. I always start with them. And you can just see everyone else. Oh, wow. I thought they were just here to listen. Well, Joe's actually talking to them. What's that all about? Yeah. Which, you and I both know what it's about.
Well, I think it's funny. I've got a quick anecdote for you that I think is somewhat, I hadn't thought about this when I was doing my notes for this conversation. I didn't think this was going to go to this, but it is kind of a funny story because I think it focuses on specific knowledge and what can you potentially know that no one else in the room knows as kind of a trick for younger employees.
That's interesting.
How you find a voice. And so this is way back in the day. I was working for Texas Pacific Group on the potential acquisition of Aerolíneas Argentinas, which was the state-owned airline in Argentina. And at that time, TPG owned Continental Airlines. And we were competing against American Airlines to try and buy Aerolíneas Argentinas from the government. And so I was the lowest person on the totem pole. I was an associate at TPG, Newbridge Latin America, which is their Latin American funds. And but I'd been able to arrange a meeting with President Carlos Menem through a friend who I called and said, can we get a meeting? And they put the meeting together. So everyone's like, wow, you got a meeting with Menem. That's great. And so then what began was all the politics about who was going to come to the meeting with Menem. And so David Bonderman wanted to come down from the States to meet with him. And then David Grizzle, who ran business development for Continental Airlines, was going to come. And then the head of TPG Latin America, and then the head of TPG Argentina. And then there were a bunch of other people who all wanted to be in the room. And there were about 20 efforts to knock me off the invite list. But since I was meeting together, I had a seat in the meeting because I got the meeting.
You were the
so we're sitting down, and there's Menem at the end of the table, and he's got his translator. And then there's Bonderman, and there's Grizzle, and there's Rogelio Pagano, and there's all these people. And I'm at the very, very end of the table. And so we start going. And of course, I'm not supposed to speak in this meeting. I mean, David Bonderman running one of the largest buyout firms in the world, and David Grizzle, who runs business development for Continental, they're the ones who are going to speak in the meeting. And Menem's doing this simultaneous translation, and I hear, and I spoke and still do speak fluent Spanish. And so all of a sudden the President Menem is responding to a Bonderman question, and it's going to the translator, and I hear what he's saying, and I know the answer because I speak fluent Spanish. And other than Rogelio, I was the only person on our team who spoke Spanish. And so with a little bit of gumption, I jump in and say, Señor Presidente, and I start to respond to Menem's question and cut through the translator. And I guarantee you, Joe, every single person in that room, other than Bonderman, sat there and goes, what the you-know-what is he doing jumping in on this conversation? Bonderman had this huge smile on his face of saying, we got this gringo down at the end of the table who actually speaks fluent Spanish, and that might actually help our chances here. And then Menem and I start having this conversation back and forth without the translator. And I guess as I think back on that, it is all the kind of dynamics of being the junior person in the room, not really having a voice, but then also having specific knowledge or specific skill that actually allows you to engage and provide something to the conversation that maybe others in the room don't have.
Yeah. Well, it's also powerful that Bonderman didn't shut you down. I mean, this is a person that has grown and matured and been around a lot of moves. Say, wait a minute. I now got a young guy that knows what he's talking about, knows him. Let him go, let him go. And, if he has to bail you out, he'll figure out how to bail you out. But that was two things. You had gumption, which that is not always easy, I do admit. But him actually allowing you to, engage like that shows real leadership. And those other guys probably next time thought, oh, wait, the young guy knows something. Let's let him talk. I'm sure they all learned a little bit about leadership. That's a great story. That's a great story. I thought you were going to say the president spoke to you first as the guy that organized the meeting. That would also be a very powerful story.
When we walked in, actually, just going back on it, when we walked in, he knew, because it was the Minister of Economy who used to be the Argentine ambassador to the U.S., who I got to know in D.C., who put the meeting together. And so when I walked in, Menem was extremely nice to me and knew that I knew the Minister of Economy. But once the meeting started, it was sort of, if you will, all business, and there was no preference. I don't think he had any sense that he was going to talk to me until I jumped in. But anyway, let's talk for a moment about head, hand, and heart, because I think in head, hand, and heart, you pull together a number of the themes as it relates to the type of leadership that you see as being appropriate for today's world.
Yeah. Well, yes. No, of course. I mean, it goes also back to the Joaquin statement. I mean, and some people have said to me, well, Joe, it's all about being generous. What about getting results and all that? And this is arguing that the head, you've got to vision, strategy, thinking through how to engage. Of course, that's critical. The hands, driving metrics, getting it done, whether you're doing it or setting up but the more you bring the human out, especially when I don't like to say the young people, but there's so much data about the next generations looking for an organization with purpose. They're leaders with values. They want, because the work life, we can talk about it, world is just blurred so much. Now you're on holiday. If you weren't, you might be in your home and I'm in one of my, it's just blurred so much that the people do need to bring their full self, or want to, or have no choice but to bring their full self to work and want to be seen as a human and as a person, not just a cog in an organization's wheel. The day of the white shirt and blue suit IBM thing. Remember those days? I just think, of course, are gone. Look how we're both dressed too. Those days are just gone. And so I think that heart, in every leader, that heart was always there, but the heart's got to get equal, either more or equal. I don't care, equal play in how you're going to really motivate and inspire people. And when you motivate and inspire people, just kind of a trite statement, that is, of course, when the best outcomes come for any of your companies. It's not, I don't think maybe some geniuses, but I don't think many leaders can do it all themselves. They can get it so far. And then, if the team's not picking it up, good luck to you.
When did you, as a leader, start talking about your own personal journey as it relates to your parents getting divorced, your mom dying at not a young age, but your mom died when I think you were 30, and then your father and your relationship with your dad and your dad's life after getting divorced from your mom. I mean, that's all very personal. When did you find the voice to be able to talk about all that openly to the point where someone like me knows about it?
Yeah, it took a long, well, probably the divorce. I think that one's easy because the percentage, and the death is sad, but it was really my dad. And I don't think you said, but my dad was gay, which is quite fascinating as a young boy, the 70s and 80s or 60s and 70s. Well, I didn't figure it out till probably the 80s. I mean, like, how am I here? Why am I here? I didn't, the questions that go to you. And today you think, well, why'd you even, of course, today's different. This is 1960s, 1970s. And we did live in the Bay Area. It took me a long time. I mean, I could go too long, but it took me a long time to even recognize myself that he was gay. And when he finally had AIDS pills on the shelf, it was undeniable. Then I think I had to acknowledge this. Now, then it took me, let's see, probably 10 years ago. So 25 years as a BCGer. And so maybe at 7, you start to lead more and more. So 7 to 15 years before I finally would be open about that. And, along the way, to be honest with you, I'd felt the value of being vulnerable. I cry quickly. I don't sob, but I cry quickly. And one colleague, my chief of staff, said, well, Joe, actually, when you cry, you just free all of us to actually show more of ourselves. So it's actually a good thing. Not a good thing to cry all the time, but when things are emotional and powerful, I'm not afraid to show it. So I thought, I'm going to just go out there and talk about this in front of a couple hundred people as our Pride Network meeting. And that was interesting in itself because I don't want them to think, oh, I understand your life, because I don't really. It's just my dad. But I wasn't completely lost on their life, given my dad. So it took me 20 years, comfort with myself. And then even when I talked about it, a lot of thinking about what would I say to this group. And it's kind of was my own reveal. I mean, it sounds silly, but, it's me stepping across probably the most vulnerable line for me at that stage. And, I know young people today with, well, what are you talking about? This is, not so unusual today, but this was a long time ago,
That's interesting because in the book you talk, Joe, about, if you will, not assuming you know anyone else's life experience. In other words, like really good leaders listen and understand that no one's life, no one's perception on anything is identical. You and I both went to Harvard Business School. But that doesn't mean that you and I perceive Harvard Business School or have the exact same Harvard Business School experience. So I can't sit there and say, oh, Joe had exactly the same experience at HBS as I did. Therefore, I can sort of know what his experience was like. And I think a lot of people do sort of make assumptions about one's life experience, about one's perceptions of various things, and then think that they know. And oftentimes, as you write, that's a big no-no. Like constantly remind yourself that everyone's life experience is distinct and make sure that you're learning from them and asking them the right questions so that you do understand their view on it. Just as you said, you can't, when you talk to the Pride group at BCG, you have your own issue on that, but you don't know what it's like to actually be gay and come out. It may have been your own issue to deal with, which you understand if I revealed something that previously I didn't want to reveal, but that's obviously very different than what they've all had to deal with on their own.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's interesting because you're right. Even, you mentioned DE&I earlier, and people call, all the white people could assume, oh yeah, we all have the same background. We all have the same lived experiences. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we're even close to understanding, a Black person's lived experience, someone that's an immigrant, someone's first generation college, but there's all kinds of But even that's, to your point, that's a big mistake to assume, as you said, you and I have the exact same way of thinking. And the mistake is like you don't get the richest set of insights out of your people. And if you just assume something about, you just start to stifle them, obviously. It was that was one thing that when I did finally talk about that with this group, I was also worried that it'd be backlash of, oh, who do you think you are? But it's just, not of course. Thankfully, it was the opposite. Oh, well, thank you for sharing a little bit about you. And let me tell you a little bit more about me. It just opened up this whole human connection that you never know when it's going to be valuable. That sounds too tribal. You never know we're in a team together. And the fact that you've got a connection like that makes for much more powerful, working together, et cetera. When you're stuck, the last thing you want is to, stay stuck and go sit in your office. It's just in business, there's not enough time. And I was thinking of an interesting story on this vulnerability. It's just a simple little story. I was a young consultant, I don't know, second or third year in, and didn't know how to do something, some kind of math thing. I didn't know how to do an analysis. So I walked down to the senior partner of my team and said, I don't know how to do this. Now, obviously I was brave enough to do that, to ask him. It's very interesting. He could have, what he did say is, I don't know either. Let's walk down and ask this other person, which, very tiny thing signaled to me, a little vulnerability if I don't know isn't the end of the world. We'll go find the next, the power of teamwork, the power of asking questions. And you think about it, he could have said, hey, Joe, I'm busy, go away, and then gone and get the answer and then tell me later. He could have said, what's wrong with you? Go figure it out. But instead, it sent a very powerful signal on, the power of revealing where you don't know, and going and asking for help. It's so much faster.
Yeah, I hate to go back to another HBS experience, but I've just got one that's just a little bit too much on that in sort of the most dramatic form. My Finance 1 professor was a gentleman. It wasn't Finance 1. It was called I can't remember what it was. One of those acronyms that you and I both remember from Willy and Biggie and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
And so Bill Bruns was my financial reporting and accounting prof. And we were going through discounted cash flows. And he's going through this case and we're going over it. And he's like, all right, great, we're done. And I just didn't have it. And I raised my hand and I said, could you go back and go through that again? Because I'm not getting what you're saying there. And I could tell that there was like this gasp in the room of someone being like, he just raised his hand and said he didn't understand something. And you don't ever, once the teacher's told you what you're supposed to, you're smart enough to learn it.
Yeah, so let's go figure it out.
Bruns went back and he retaught it. In the restroom after that class, one of my section mates made a really snarky comment to me of sort of like, dumb guy, you should have gotten it on the first one. And I sat there and felt pretty damn insecure about it. And then at the end of the semester, Joe, I got a 1 in that class. And I guarantee you to this day, the only reason I got a 1 in that class, the people listening at HBS, it's a forced curve. You've got 10% of the class gets 1s, which is an A. 80% of the class gets a 2, which is a C, and 10% of the class gets 3, which is an F. And so the forced curve makes it. And so the only reason Bruns gave me that was because I raised my hand that day, showed vulnerability, and asked him to reteach something, which I'm pretty sure he probably thought, 10 or 20% of the class probably was exactly where I was, but nobody else was going to raise their hand and say, would you reteach that? And I just, I still have the name of the guy who made that snarky comment in the men's room after the class. I got to tell you, he got blacklisted in my head pretty hard for the rest of my life of saying, yeah, you know what? You're kind of preying on me right now. And that's not a lot of fun and not making me feel all that good. But it is interesting how leaders, and Bruns was clearly the leader there, can reward people who take those steps and show that vulnerability because they know everyone in the room is learning from that experience.
Yeah. I'll bet you said 10 to 20%. You and I will never know the facts. I'll bet you 30 to 50% didn't know what happened either. The problem is back then, no one would come up to you and thank you. Today, probably people will come and thank you. Hey, thanks for asking that question. I was stuck too. I didn't have the guts. So, yeah. But I still think your 1 is for that reason. I think that's insightful.
No, but that's a really interesting point. So how do leaders capitalize on that? So we just talked about sort of where you and I were in that world of, put on the ties, you go to the GE management meeting and you don't want to tell Jack Welch that anything's wrong. You've been working at, wherever. But in today's world, it's very different that people might come up to you and say, thanks for sharing. Thanks for showing that vulnerability. How do you counsel leaders to capitalize on that, create that kind of an environment?
Well, I'll just use your example. Just think, what was his name? What was the professor's name?
Bill Bruns.
Bruns. I got Bonderman in my head.
Yeah.
Bill Bruns had said at the moment, wow, Willie, that's a good question. First off, did anyone else not get it? That would have said, and even if 10 had, well, I'm sure more of you, he could have behaved a whole different way. Now, HBS professors back then didn't show any vulnerability either, as I ever noticed. It was, but that would have been a very powerful, in other words, engaging with you in a positive conversation, which enables everybody else to say, oh, okay, it's okay to be a little bit off here. But I bet you $1 million if he'd said, well, that's a great question. I'm sure not everybody, he could even stop there. I'm sure not everybody gets it. Let's just go back through that. Or you could have been better. Anyone else not get that too? What part didn't you get? So I can make sure I answer that really well. There's a lot of ways by acknowledging your, I'll call it honesty instead of vulnerability, by acknowledging your honesty and your guts or nerve to actually put it out there, you're helping a lot of people. And that'd be one. I think that's the thing that leaders can do, is acknowledge those moments. Not just like my friend Steve, I mentioned, he didn't trash me for not having the answer. He actually said, oh, I don't know either. Let's ask another person. What a powerful message. So that's what I think that's how I think a leader should behave in those moments, is acknowledge that vulnerability. Know damn well that more than one person's feeling that way. There's no way you're the only person feeling that way in anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's interesting. Talk about engaging the skeptics. So we could sit there and say that guy who gave me a hard time in the men's room after the class was a skeptic. How do you engage the skeptic?
Well, I think he was worse than that, but I won't use the word in a live podcast. That's funny. What I would like to know is, don't answer this, what his career was like and how would it go along the way and all this stuff. So, actually, this goes back to... Let's just say, people who know me, Joe, will not be surprised that I've followed his career and feel very, very good about where I am today. Well, good. You've only proven the point.
That's all. I was hoping that's not in any way to
No. I had a buddy at early days of Procter & Gamble who was as a sales guy. He was real slap on the back and he moved boom, boom, real fast. And I was like, gosh, I thought Procter, and he wasn't that good. So I thought P&G was a good place. What the hell? Well, after 3 fast moves, then he was gone, because it was just slapping on the back and being an aw shucks kind of guy. So to your point on engaging the skeptics, actually, that's why I'm a big believer in that. It's all part of this whole listening and really understanding what you know that I don't know. And actually be another bit of advice to young people. I'll often tell people, go engage the skeptics and uncover the no's. Now, this doesn't work in that case where that guy was picking on you. But what? Because usually a noologist, quote unquote, isn't a blocker. Often we'll think, oh, they're just trying to block it. They don't want change. That's not true. That might be, I don't know, 1 out of 100 times, 1 out of 50 times. What it is they know something you don't know about whatever idea it is won't work. And you need to know that. If you don't know that, you're just going to get bit. I'll tell another story. Someone told me the story. I wasn't part of this project, but we were doing some work for a client to talk about moving some of their operations from one place to another place. We'd done great analysis, blah, 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 all the numbers, and showed you should move here. The team presented the work. And at the end of the CEO said, well, this is great. And that's a good site and that's saving money. But I have the most diverse workforce in the existing place. How are you going to replicate that workforce down there? Are you telling me I have to lose all this diversity? Well, the BCG room, shame on them, just kind of silence because they hadn't thought through that. And afterwards, the partner on the team said to the guy that's running the project, well, what the hell? And he said, well, do you expect me to be an EEOC expert? He said, no, but I expect you to go engage with those people that are experts and understand, now they may not have been skeptics, but understand why something won't work. So I do, and I'm always into who doesn't think this is a good idea and why? And now let's try to solve the why together. And that's what I mean by engage the skeptics if you're trying to get anything done.
So a lot of what you write about in the book, Joe, in my mind is, if you will, tips to leadership in a relatively traditional corporate context. In the way of, be generous as a communicator, be generous as a listener, be inclusive, find allies, generous in development, generous about making moments and moments count, giving up the mask. How, as you wrote this, did you think about, when I think about Satya Nadella at Microsoft and how incredible a leader he is, but also how big an organization Microsoft is. So if I can, as you think about people like Christoph Schweitzer, I'm assuming you're going to say he's a generous leader who runs BCG. When you've got 32,000 employees, I mean, I've got 1,400. I can't meet with all of them. I have my own way of communicating with our team. But when I think about a global organization of 32,000, or what Satya has at Microsoft, which is hundreds of thousands, the ability to be the generous leader that you talk about only allows you to engage with people so much, only allows you to do so much. How have you seen leaders, if you will, leverage off of modern communication skills, modern meeting skills, Zoom, whatever else, that says that person not only has the ability to be their true selves as the leader they've been identified by either the board of directors or their managers to become the leader of this organization, but then have been able to take all these things in your book and then blow them out on a very, very wide scale?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I mean, I think first, of course, in those roles, you need to be role modeling all the time, right? It's, somewhere, I think of Arne Sorensen. If you saw that video, remember the video? So here he is. And of course, it was sad. He had cancer, but he told us, and he was bald from the chemo, and his tie was askew. And he said, he was very vulnerable about this. Was during COVID when Marriott, I think they'd furloughed tens of thousands of people. They didn't fire him. They furloughed. And he was very honest with the group in that video. It went to 880,000 employees about, we're going to go through this together. I don't know what's going to come. I don't know when instead of pretending I got all the answers, he role modeled very clearly, but this is what we're going to do together. Here's how we're going to make this work. I mean, that was a great example. That's a unique circumstance for him to be able to role model that. But I do think first and foremost is to role model these things. It's easy to role model vulnerability. You do whatever one's comfortable with. But, I'll tell you another story about Joaquin when he's trying to connect with, you do a video that goes across or a town hall or whatever. He actually he calls these things friend testing or group testing. Like he'll get a group together and practice his speech, people that obviously work for him. And he'll say, okay, well, what did I say? And then they'll say words and he'll get a pen out, write down the words they use, not the words he said, because those are the words they heard. And then he'll say, now tell me if you had to go home tonight and tell this at the dinner table with your family, what was my whole speech about? And he'll listen and say, oh, wow, they heard this. I said that. Either I got to incorporate their words or I'm just not making any sense. And because they didn't even get my point. That's an example of what someone can do to make sure you're really connecting with where they're listening and what they're hearing. And then, of course, when you're providing the messages. I think the other so I really just think this is all about the role modeling. And I've made it, just even, for example, when I'll go to corporate in a minute, but, who do you address first when you're in a meeting? Who do you ask more questions about? I mean, do you only talk to your chief of staff or do you talk to the finance person who's or the HR person? The other thing I think is you also, of course, every company does differently, but there's different metrics you can put in to encourage different type of behaviors. It's very interesting. When I moved to the West Coast, the West Coast was kind of wobbly and ended up doing pretty well while I was there for a lot of reasons. But one thing that the BCG, review team at the time, of which of course I was part of, but when it's my turn, I step out of the room. But they came back and said, "Gross, Joe, it's great. Not just did the whole West Coast grow, and not just are you doing well, but every one of the officers, the partners, all of their performance is up. So somehow you've lifted all of them." It was a very powerful message to me. So it wasn't about me doing well and helping the West Coast do well. It was actually everybody's now doing well. So you must be doing something right, and so I think that you could put metrics in that retention in an area, if you have people surveys, how is each leader doing and how are people feeling in those groups? I think those kind of metrics you can also put in place to send the right signals. And then, as somebody says, who you reward and who you promote. If you promote one set of persons, but send one signal. You promote someone who's, more of a generous servant or holistic leader, that sends another set of signals. I mean, that P&G person, which I told you about, pretty powerful to me that he lost his job after 3 quick promotions. That sent a big signal. And actually, I wondered, I said, I thought P&G was one of the best companies in the world. This is, 40 years ago. Why the heck would that person survive? But he didn't. And he wasn't a bad person. He just wasn't as good as he talked,
So there are a couple other sort of, if you will, suggestions / if you will, best practices that you talk about. One of them is about, small acts as a leader, having a big impact.
Big impact.
I still write birthday cards to every employee at Walker & Dunlop. It takes a heck of a lot of time for me to do it, but
good for you.
I get lots and lots of comments as it relates to, it was one thing when we were a company of 40 people. It's another thing when you're a company of 1,400. And my wrist literally does get tired on flights as I'm flying across the country doing birthday cards. And not just signing them, but writing notes to most people. But you talk about those, what I would call sort of random acts of kindness. How do you do it on a scaled basis? I mean, I do it with 1,400, but you work with much, much larger companies than Walker & Dunlop, where you see these incredible leaders do those small acts that make such a big difference for their teams and for their own, I guess the efficacy of their leadership would be a way I'd put it. What have you seen people do?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's funny. Hans Paul, the two previous CEOs ago, would call every partner. And he still does it to this day. And it's like, there's like 2,000 of us. Your letters are harder. I actually write thousands of Christmas cards, and I won't write it if I can't write a note. But that's a big, small act. Both of those are pretty big. So, a couple of things. I do think let me just start with the story. Scott Kirby, the CEO of United, his wife was on a plane, he was telling me, and the captain came out and said, "Oh, Mrs. Kirby, great to see you on my flight. I'm so pleased you're here. And I love United, and I love your husband. Not love, but I really respect and love your husband." And she goes, "Oh, why? What's going on?" So, and she was a woman, black woman. And he said, when the George Floyd was killed, when he was murdered, he called every captain who was a person of color and just checked in. He didn't have the answer for us. He didn't have, do this and that. He just said, "How you doing? I'm here for you. We're here for you." Short call. You can imagine now. Well, your cards is not a small act, but that may be a little bit of a big act, but not that big. Probably 20, 30-second phone calls, a minute or two. I'm not sure how many, unfortunately, probably less than he wished he could have made. Very powerful. And you bet $1 million that got around, right? For sure, to all the people of color or any sort of diverse network who that got around. And look at the loyalty of that person. So obviously, any leader can do simple things like congratulate whomever for a job well done, send an email and copy everybody else. Those are good things. Role model, remembering something about a person. Scott also said, I remember everybody, when I walk into a meeting and there's people I don't really shake my hand, they say something to me as I'm leaving. If they're there, I try to comment on what they said. I think he has one of these good memories that remembers their name, which most, a lot of us can't do, but he also at least remembers what they told him and comments back on that. These are small acts. I think the thing is scale, you just have to start leveraging. I'm sure you have somewhere either on your calendar or somewhere you've got the birthday's coming up. Someone's getting you the cards. You buy them in advance. They're addressed. I mean, you team with people to do some of these things at scale. You've got support teams that can help you do that. But I think go ahead. You're going to say something.
No, I was just going to say, it is to exactly your point, to create the systems that exist to allow for that to happen. And a lot of people sit there and say, well, my system for birthday cards is that there is a stack that I get, and it's got the person's name on the outside. It's got the actual sticky note that says when their birthday is. And then that allows me to say, I hope the 15th of May was a great day. And thanks for all you do at Walker & Dunlop. And then I take it and it's already addressed and it's already postage on it, and off it goes. So the system allows it to happen in a much better, a much more efficient way. But at the same time, obviously, if I had to go out and buy the cards, put the postage on them, look up everyone's address, you just don't have time to do it. And I do think that a lot of leaders who have big companies and big jobs, my board asked me, Joe, when we got to 500 employees at Walker & Dunlop, they literally asked me in a board meeting, do you think we're big enough where you don't have time to do birthday cards anymore? And I looked right at them and I said, good day. I don't have time to write a birthday card to every Walker & Dunlop employee on the one day of the year that is their individual day. I shouldn't be CEO of Walker & Dunlop anymore. And you know what? I'm probably going to eat those words if we do some big acquisition and go from a firm of 1,400 people to a firm of 5,000 people or whatever else. And I get to the point where it's just too much. But I think about my friend Mary Erdos, who runs asset management at JP Morgan. She runs an enormously large organization. And they have tons of research and reports that Michael Semblist, who's one of the best analysts out there, writes. And Mary always writes a personal note when I get Semblist's research. I mean, it's so easy for somebody in her group to say, JP Morgan Private Bank, here's your research from Michael Semblist, or even to have it all just written by, some stenographer that says, hey, take a look at this, Mary. But it's always got something that's unique to say, great seeing you at the asset managers meeting, or great seeing you there. Hope you and the boys are great, et cetera, et cetera. And that personal touch for somebody who is in that big a position makes such a massive difference.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking as you're talking, and especially your board story. So first off, you actually care. They probably care, but they don't know what the word means. And then you understand the people you're working with are humans. They are real people, and they want to, and then you also obviously, sorry, like to almost lecture you, but you understand small acts for what you just said have a huge impact, because they say, you, Willy, recognize me in this moment. And that's a big deal. You see me as a person because you're talking about my birthday. You see me as a human. And I'm going to, in the spirit of driving best results for business, I'm going to pay that back to you in whatever I can, in the way I contribute. And then, of course, you have to build systems as you get bigger. I bet you when it's whatever thousands, you'll figure out a system to write those cards. I believe that deeply. I mean, and you also, if you put all these things together, you care, they're human, then you find the time. I mean, sometimes you sit on a plane, a lot of people watch movies. So you write Christmas cards, or you write birthday cards. I mean, time is there for what one prioritizes, and prioritizing the humanity.
I also think, Joe, your comment about the CEO of United, we just had our all company meeting 2 weeks ago, and I probably talked to 20 to 30 of my Jewish colleagues about the tragic conflict that's going on in Israel and Gaza right now. I don't have the answer for it. It's a topic that lots of people don't want to focus on. There is no easy this side, that side, everything else. But just by engaging with them and saying, how's the family? Do you have family members who are in Israel? You could just tell that asking the question meant the world to them. And that, first of all, identifying them as Jewish, and knowing that they are Jewish, and then asking, do you have family in Israel, and how are they? And I mean, one of my colleagues has a number of family members in Israel, and has a number of family members who have served. And just engaging with him in the tragedy of the conflict and the fear and the warfare that's going on, you could just tell that he was, very appreciative of the question. And to your point, as it relates to the CEO of United Airlines, it's not as if you have the answer. It's just connecting on a one-to-one human basis, and then also caring to just say, right, I'm sorry you and your family have to deal with this conflict and deal with the sadness and the loss and and everything that is happening in the Middle East today.
Yeah. I can't add much to that. I agree with you. It's interesting because it's not, when George Floyd was killed in our firm, when you always hear these stories, something happened yesterday to my group of people and it was silent the next day. Why were you all silent? And it was because I think too often any of us said, well, I don't know what to say. I don't have the answer. But what you're just indicating, you don't have an answer. Just say, hey, are you doing okay? I saw what happened, whatever it might be. It's very, very powerful because it recognizes people where they are. I mean, you're sort of recognizing their lived experience, which is true. I mean, of course, that conflict, I think you mentioned the board chair at Whitman, and, we have the Jewish people feeling it. We have the people, Muslims / from Palestine at school. And it's so painful for both, for anyone who's watching so much death.
Yeah.
And can we end on a more positive thing?
We can, very much so. So, as you think about people who want to lead with heart and compassion, we talked a lot about it, and you've got in your book, it is chocker full of all sorts of, this is, of working with leaders for as long as you have, and also being a leader yourself who has a tremendous amount of compassion. You put those, if you will, tips inside the book and say, this is what best in class does. And we've talked about a bunch of them. But as you sit there and say, let's go back to that 29-year-old BCG consultant who's aspiring to either be the leader of BCG someday, or heaven forbid, leave BCG and go be the leader of some other enterprise or corporation.
That's not bad. That's okay.
It's okay is exactly right. You got a great alumni network of people who are running major, major corporations. But what's that advice for people who want to lead with heart and compassion?
Yeah, I guess my main advice, course, read my book, that'd be nice. But putting that aside, go see those 7 acts, their traits, and just pick one. Say, okay, I'm going to work on that more. I'm going to work on small acts. Because you may or may not turn your whole personality around instantly. And I get questions a lot. Well, people that are really tough-nosed hard asses, can they ever change? I don't know. There's probably psych books on that. But you can still practice any of these traits. You can say, okay, I'm really going to try to understand where you're coming from, Willy, and try to listen to you and learn from you. Or I'm going to congratulate people and comment on their birthday. These traits will go a long ways to showing you care, but actually putting that back to show that you recognize those with whom you're working as people, as humans. And that's very powerful. That will, reward you in spades as well as them.
Joe, it's been a pleasure. Your book is a fantastic read.
Thank you.
And congratulations on all that you have achieved since you were sitting in section G and I was sitting in section E. I actually counted them up. There are 26 Whitman graduates who have who've gone to Harvard Business School, and there are 36 St. Lawrence graduates who've gone to Harvard Business School.
Oh my. I didn't know we had that many.
I got a little edge on you. I'm not quite as much in the minority as you were, but it's fantastic. Thank you so much for spending the time. And I look forward to seeing you when I'm back in DC sometime. It'd be great to get together.
Likewise. Okay. Yeah, I think your office is right by my condo there. So
I think that's exactly right.
Thank you very
Joe.
much.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a great evening.